Abandoned, drifting and in danger. The plight of a group of Rohingya at sea risks becoming a metaphor for the entire crisis. So who's responsible to take them in? What are the consequences of the dispute? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Nearly 2,500 Rohingya refugees have risked their lives last year by taking dangerous boat journeys. They're looking for safety and better living conditions after years of systematic discrimination and persecution. Rights groups are warning thousands more could take such journeys, hoping to reach countries mainly in Southeast Asia. Well, 81 Rohingya who had been stranded in the Andaman Sea for nearly 2 weeks were rescued by the Indian coastguard on Friday. The engine of their boat had broken down in the middle of the sea. 8 people died and many fell ill, suffering severe dehydration as they ran out of food and water. Well, they left Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh with the goal of reaching Malaysia. The Indian government has been trying to arrange for their return to Bangladesh, but Bangladeshi officials say they have no obligation to shelter the Rohingya. The boat was found closer to Myanmar and Indian territories. Some have said the Andaman route, where the 81 Rohingya had been stranded, is more dangerous than the Mediterranean. More than 200 Rohingya are believed to have died or gone missing at sea just last year. More than a third of them were children. The UNHCR says international maritime rules are clear about nations having a duty to rescue those in trouble, regardless of nationality or legal status. That's where the 1951 Refugee Convention comes in. For those who've ratified the treaty, it lays out their obligations towards refugees. This includes not sending them back to the place where they face danger or denying them safe shelter. After the 2017 crackdown by Myanmar's military against the Rohingya minority, more than 740,000 have fled to Bangladesh. Many live in crowded camps with dire humanitarian conditions. The Bangladeshi government has recently relocated thousands of the refugees to a remote island. Rights groups have raised concerns about the location, though, and the risk of flooding. Bangladesh has repeatedly demanded the repatriation of the Rohingya to Myanmar. But after the recent military coup, many are afraid to go back. Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from New Delhi, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, retired Navy officer and director of Society for Policy Studies, an independent geopolitical think tank. In Vancouver, Yasminullah, a Rohingya activist and advocate, and in Colombo, Saad Hamadi, South Asia campaigner with a focus on Bangladesh for Amnesty International. A warm welcome to you all. If we could start with Commodore Uday. So, since the Indian Coast Guard found these refugees, why was India so reluctant to take them in?
India, when it was informed about this particular Rohingya boat, did what was appropriate at the time, which was to dispatch the nearest available asset that could provide water and food, because it was understood that this boat was drifting for a few days and that some people had even died on board. Having provided the water and the food and whatever they could, this boat was on its way, as we understand, from Bangladesh to Malaysia. So what India did was to contact the Bangladeshi government to see what best could be done under the circumstances. So given the current situation as far as the Rohingya refugees are
Commodore,
concerned,
if I could jump in, why contact Bangladeshi authorities if the boat is actually closer to the Indian territories?
No, it was not quite in Indian territory. It was on its way, as I said, from Bangladesh to Malaysia. And India provided immediate support to ensure that they got their food and water. But after that, India was not in a position to take the refugees and bring them to India, because if either of the governments, Bangladesh or Malaysia, were willing to take them, then India perhaps could have played a different kind of role. But India was not in a position to take them back to India because of this complex issue of refugees globally who try to reach some point by boats. And secondly, the Rohingyas itself in the regional context. So it's unfortunate, but the Rohingya issue has got very tangled in the bilateral issues as they now obtain between Myanmar and Bangladesh on one hand, and between Myanmar and the rest of ASEAN on the other. And there are other elements, if I may add.
Okay, we'll come back to you because you've made some good points there, and you used some interesting language, which I think opens the door for us to discuss a lot of things when you said tangled and you said the regional context. Let's bring in Saad Hamadi. Under international law, who is responsible for sheltering a group of refugees when they're found at the sea?
It's a very important question that you've raised, and like you've asked about the international human rights law or the international law that you talk about. We've seen as recently as last year the Task Force or Bali Declaration, where the countries have emphasized about saving lives at sea, irrespective of what kind of migration it has been, whether it has been irregular migration or a regular legal form of migration. It's more of a concern of the human lives at that time when they're stranded in the sea. And in these cases, we've seen last year, several hundred Rohingya people have been stranded in the sea in many occasions. 200 people are reported to have died. And there was this situation for, I think, about 2,400 people last year. Bangladesh has taken back 700 of them. The others have been stranded for a long time and then eventually found some spaces in other countries such as Indonesia. Now, the question that you've asked about who is responsible, it's supposed to be the nearest state and the state that has the territorial jurisdiction to respond, because this is a crisis situation. The boat is stranded. It's not able to go. It's not like it's taking a break in the ocean. So clearly,
Saad, let me play devil's advocate and for the Indian perspective and say, look, if this is a boatload of non-citizens who are not technically on Indian territory and they're trying to get somewhere else, does India still have an obligation, or any country which finds them, still have an obligation to say, no, we must take you into our care and shelter?
So that's the human rights law, and that's where member states have made their commitments to protect lives of people who are at risk in the sea. And clearly, it's about the nearest state who can respond at that time, who have their capacities and the deployment in the ocean to come and save those lives. We can't just let them stay there for days and then see them die. And as you know, that there have been at least 8 people who were on that boat and who have died, and we don't know how many else are now at that same risk.
Okay, interesting point. Yasmin Allah, why were these Rohingya refugees trying to get to Malaysia? Would they have wanted to stay in India if they had the opportunity?
Genuinely, I don't know the answers to that. The issue is much, much bigger than we think. And when we frame this issue as people illegally using, or crossing into the borders of a different nation states, we actually take out and reduct the framing of the issue around humanity, around the root cause of the problems, of why there is such a factor that puts the Rohingya refugees at this much need to actually flee or leave a nation state in specific. Right now, we're talking about Bangladesh. We have established long ago that there is a lot of human rights issues that are happening within Bangladesh. And of course, that is not a responsibility of one nation state alone. It's actually a collective responsibility. When genocide and mass atrocity take place, that the international community needs to care for the victims. But the victims and the human agency, that should come with caring for refugees, for people who are fleeing the violence in their homeland, is not really in place, and we've seen more and more people trying to flee as a result of that. it's difficult to determine, whether or not they're going to find a safe haven anywhere. As we've heard the discussion just now, I feel as a Rohingya, as if there isn't really a place for us on this earth, and that the ocean is the only safe place for us.
That's a very sad thing to hear. Commodore Uday, I want to bring you back to actually a point you mentioned when you said concerns about getting tangled up and the regional context. We just heard there from Saad that according to international law, the country that finds refugees in danger should take them in. Very clear in international law. Is the underlying, perhaps, or unspoken truth of India's reluctance is India is worried. It doesn't want to take in a group of, or any more Rohingya refugees that might encourage others to come because, as you said, India doesn't want to become more entangled in what is seen as a regional problem that is not my problem, each country is thinking.
Well, I'd frame it slightly differently. First of all, I think India and the larger issue of refugees, I would say that India has gone the extra mile historically. Just to remind ourselves, in 1970...
But historically doesn't mean anything if you're not looking out for your obligations in this particular context, right? I mean, for these group of people at sea, if somebody's obliged to help them and it doesn't really help them telling them, well, we've historically been more helpful to others. They're still at risk at sea in a boat.
No, sir. With the utmost respect, I'd like to differ. There is a need to remember the historical context, which is that India had taken more than 10 million refugees at a certain point in time. Now, when we speak about the regional context, when you talk about international law, there is the code of the sailor at sea, which is that when there is any life in distress, the nearest ship or the nearest platform that can provide relief to endangered life will act as per the code of the sea, the code of the sailor. But once that kind of support or relief is provided, when it comes to refugees globally, we have seen this in the Mediterranean, when refugees from the Maghreb have tried to access Southern Europe. We have seen this in the case of refugees trying to reach Australia. Different countries have discharged their obligations as per the 1951 Convention on Refugees. Now, for the record, this is only a legal point. India is not a signatory to the 1951 Convention, but yet it has a very large number of refugees and asylum seekers already. The Rohingyas, I'm repeating my words, sir, is tangled because of the geopolitics and the bilateral between Myanmar and Bangladesh on one hand, and between Myanmar and the other ASEAN countries, which, as I said, has a certain history to it. And in this case, I would say the global community has abdicated as far as the Rohingya is concerned. I think what Ms. Yasmin said is a very sad but true statement. The Rohingyas are stateless. And in the United Nations Security Council, we have China, which is a permanent member, which could have played a more substantive role in respect to Myanmar, definitely, perhaps in the regional context, but has chosen to remain silent. So this, I think, is the global tragedy, that we are devoid of empathy.
All right, let me take that point to Saad Hamadi. Is it enough to say, look, we've answered the call of the sea, we're not signatories to the 1951 Convention?
This is a very sad situation because, I mean, instead of taking the responsibility, I think every country is passing the responsibility onto the other state, whereas they are all signatories to protection of human rights of individuals. It's not just the 1951 Refugee Convention, and many countries aren't signatories to it, but there are certain rules that are binding on all states, such as the principle of non-refoulement, but that's for refugees who are in the territory. In this situation, like I mentioned about the Bali Declaration and the Task Force of Bali Declaration's commitment just last year in February, where they have emphasized on saving lives in distress at sea. And saving lives is not just about extending relief relief support with food and water. It's also about their safe disembarkation. If they're stuck in the sea, if the boat is not functioning, if they're stranded for several weeks, they clearly need a better place than just being on the boat or in some place in the high sea. And that's something I think every country has been ignoring and passing it on to other states about why that country is not doing it, why this country is not doing it, and why should we do it. I think that's something we've been hearing from almost all the other countries.
All right, let me play devil's advocate a moment with you, Yasmin, and ask the question. Some would say, why did they leave Bangladesh? They had the relative safety of camps in Bangladesh, and they go out to sea and risk their lives even further. Why?
That is a really good question. We are talking about a group of people who have been categorically disenfranchised, tortured, and ostracized from their own community. There is a lot of fragmentation.
You're talking about in
psyche
Myanmar now, right? The
Yes,
human rights abuses which have been
from Myanmar.
documented by human rights groups in Myanmar, just to be clear, right?
Exactly. And as a result, we are seeing a group of people with unhealed trauma for, at the very, very, for a very simple reason that they have fled. To this day, they have not been given enough resources to endure their day-to-day functions. They're still restricted in a lot of ways, facing a lot of harsh reality on the ground in the camps, and now with the issues of being sort of forced to relocate into Basan Char, the isolated island. There is so many factors that is just playing against the Rohingya, playing against the odds that they are going to be capable of envisioning a better future any day. And the issue of the coup and the current uncertainty of life within Bangladesh and in Myanmar, the fragmentation and the family separation and so many other issues that pile on, us as individuals just no longer are capable of dealing with it on our own. And this is a failure of a collective responsibility that the international community have neglected for a very, very long time. It's a human struggle. It's very, very simple. It actually extends further than the border lines. It's actually not about people leaving and who is responsible, but it's about what do we owe to each other? Don't we at least owe humanity?
All right. Let's bring in Saad. The right, humane response, the logical one or the legal one, is that people should be repatriated back to their homes, but in safety, not where they're going to be persecuted. Is the reality here is that as time goes on, this is looking less and less likely, especially after that coup in Myanmar?
Certainly. The coup makes the possibility of safe, voluntary, dignified and sustainable returns even more uncertain. And I must repeat that we've interviewed several Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar over the years. And in most occasions, we've heard that they want to go back when the conditions are safe, when it's conducive, when their rights are restored, including their citizenship rights, that they feel dignified and they'd be safe in that country to go back. Certainly the coup doesn't guarantee, and it makes it far away from those guarantees. The Tatmadaw, or the military in Myanmar, is accused of the horrific crimes against humanity and against the Rohingya that they have committed. And clearly, this makes it even more volatile right now. And we must also remember, we're talking about the people of Myanmar who feel unsafe right now, who are on the streets protesting. But it's also the people, the Rohingya people, who are displaced outside the country because of these conflicts. We shouldn't forget that it's not just the people internally displaced. It's not the people who are affected right now. It's also people who are outside the country who are equally affected and who must be taken into consideration, who should have that opportunity to go back if they wish to, and under those conditions. So the pressure really should build on the Myanmar government, and the international community has a role there to really create that condition for the people to go back in safe, voluntary and sustainable conditions and dignified conditions to their homes.
Commodore Day, you mentioned there that, well, several countries have I think the words used was kind of abrogated their responsibilities towards the Rohingya. Does that make it, you mentioned there that we've seen similar scenarios involving other refugees going over the Mediterranean. Is that an acceptable argument, or are we downgrading here really the global legal responsibilities which Saad pointed out, as well as the humane ones which Yasmin pointed out, to help refugees? Is that whole concept being globally downgraded to navies as they go out and deal with the refugee problem?
Sir, it's not an argument. It's a very sad observation about the status of the refugee and the asylum seeker globally. At last count, the UNHCR in 2020 had estimated there were about 26 million plus refugees and about 4.5 million asylum seekers. And my observation was that the global community has abdicated. Rarely do you find the United Nations at the level of the Security Council talking about some effective steps. Whatever has happened is a regional kind of effort. And here I want to add two things, if I may. Why did this particular boat proceed from Bangladesh to Malaysia when, as you had raised this point, they had the shelter of the camps in Bangladesh? My conjecture, again, sir, as an analyst, is that it appears that there is a fair amount of illegal trafficking of human beings from Bangladesh towards different parts of ASEAN and Southern Asia. And it appears, again, that they were being trafficked, maybe. And the other point is, I think Bangladesh is to be commended, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina in particular, at a certain point in providing whatever little shelter and safety that Bangladesh could, and that should be acknowledged.
All right, you raised a question. Let's take it to Saad. From the research and the documentation that you do, why are people fleeing Bangladesh? Are they being... this is not the first boatload of Rohingya to try and make it to Malaysia, right? Why are they leaving Bangladesh? Are these people, the majority of these people, being trafficked? Or are they simply running away from very difficult circumstances in some of the camps in Bangladesh?
Thank you for that question. It's a very important one, and I think we should also look into why these Rohingya people are in Bangladesh. They have fled persecution in their homes, and now they're in Bangladesh. We must also note here that no one really wants to become a refugee, because a refugee status, in spite of all the guarantees and security that the human rights law provides, isn't the identity that you'd want to hold onto for the rest of your life. You want to enjoy the rights as guaranteed to everyone as individual.
Right.
In Bangladesh, in the refugee camps that they are living in, it's certainly not the best of conditions. It's a threadbare camp. It's highly congested. It's densely populated. The refugees have limitations with regards to their access to healthcare, access to education, access to livelihood. Right. Under those circumstances, if there are refugees who are taking these irregular routes, it's very natural that they want to live better, and in that hope, right, they take this risk. And that's what leads them to this kind of situation.
All right. Well, I think we've just got a minute left, and I want to give the final word, if I may, to Yasmin Allah. Are you at all concerned that what is happening here, in reality, is turning the Rohingyas into some kind of long-term stateless people like the Palestinians? We hear about an island, Bhasan Char, now being set up for the Rohingyas.
Yes. I very, very much worry about that every single day. I fear that every now and then, every single crisis that emerge, we are going to be, continuously ostracized as an unwanted group of people, because the international community cannot really come to a conclusion or come to a realization that it is the collective responsibility to prevent genocide from happening in the first place. And us, as a result, we become the victim that have been neglected for a very long time. And in this time, it is even more apparent that Rohingya are not given enough support, enough aid. We're not acknowledged for our agency. We're not at the discussion table. We are not being listened to. And so the issue can be resolved very easily if the international covenant on human rights are taken a little bit more seriously by all parties.
Let's end on that on a slightly more hopeful note that the parties will take this more seriously and find a solution. Let's thank our guests now, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Yasminullah and Saad Hammadi. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the entire team here, for now, is goodbye.